Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into a question that feels, well, frustratingly persistent.
Right. Why is it so incredibly hard to get meaningful action on huge global challenges? Things like climate change, resource depletion.
Exactly. We've been looking at some really powerful sources here, particularly research from the Global Footprint Network and insights from Mathis Wackernagel.
And they focus on this concept they call overshoot.
Yes, and our mission in this deep dive to really try and cut through the noise, understand what these sources say, is the real barrier to
And
actions.
maybe uncover a completely different way of looking at the whole situation.
One that might just align with your own risks and opportunities. This isn't just about these big abstract problems way out there.
No, it's about insights that could affect your situation, personally or professionally.
That's the goal. And the material we're exploring suggests the core issue isn't necessarily, say, a lack of science or not enough
Or
solutions.
even just, basic human nature being flawed. They argue it's something more subtle.
Yeah, about how we actually perceive the challenge itself.
hmm
All right, so let's start at the beginning then. What exactly is overshoot in the context of this research?
Well, at its simplest, overshoot is the persistent overuse of the planet's ecological resources.
Like spending down the capital, not just the interest.
Precisely.
Sure.
Spending nature's principle, not living off the interest it generates. And the research makes it clear this isn't some future problem.
It's happening now.
It's happening right now in the 21st century, year after year, globally.
And the consequences, reading through this, they seem to go way beyond just the obvious environmental stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
I mean, yes, overshoot is the engine driving environmental crises, climate change, biodiversity loss, resource depletion, deforestation, all of that.
hmm
But the authors show how it spills over, how it fuels critical economic, geopolitical, and even health challenges.
Okay, economic challenges, like what
Well,
specifically?
they link it directly to issues like stagflation.
Stagflation, you mean like inflation plus economic stagnation?
Yeah.
How does overshoot cause that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point the material explains. There's a note that unpacks it. Basically, resource scarcity makes it physically harder and more expensive to get stuff, to extract it, transport it.
Right, so that pushes prices up inflation.
Exactly. And at the same time, assets and whole economies that rely heavily on that cheap resource input
Yeah.
or are vulnerable to ecological disruption,
Mm.
well, they start to lose value. That brings stagnation.
Okay.
They mentioned the 70s oil crisis as kind of a historical parallel, but stress that this modern form, driven by broader overshoot, is avoidable if a country or a company responds effectively to its resource reality.
So economic pain is one major consequence. What else did the sources highlight?
It makes geopolitical and health issues much worse. Think about food and energy security. They become way more precarious.
Right.
And health crises, too. Another note details how factors tied to overshoot amplify health risks. You've got dense populations, intensive animal farming.
Which can breed disease.
Right. Combine that with global mobility, spreading things fast, climate change, creating new habitats for disease vectors like mosquitoes.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the whole issue of antibiotic overuse, weakening our defenses. It's this complex, interconnected web.
Then conflict over resources.
That's another piece of it, yes. Conflict over dwindling resources becomes more likely.
So it's not just one isolated problem. It's like a multiplier effect across loads of different systems.
Exactly. And the research highlights something really critical here.
What's that?
The biggest threat isn't actually overshoot itself, which they state will inevitably end one way or another.
Limits will be reached.
Limits will be reached. The real danger is failing to respond to it, failing to prepare proactively and in time.
Okay, that brings us right to the central puzzle, doesn't it? If the problem is this big, this impactful, why isn't there more meaningful action? The material addresses this directly, right?
It does. And this is where their core argument about the barrier comes in. They essentially hypothesize that the lack of sufficient desire for real action often comes down to a misaligned perception.
How so?
It's the belief, the feeling, that the cost of acting seems to outweigh the direct personal benefits you'd get.
Like that phrase one source used, the therapy is more painful than the disease idea.
Precisely that. And this feeds directly into what they describe as the free rider dilemma mindset.
Ah, the classic free rider problem.
Right. People feel stuck. They think their individual interests clash with the collective well-being.
So they think, why should I spend my money or effort if my neighbor isn't? I'll just wait and see what happens, maybe benefit later if others act.
Exactly that calculation. They believe their own costly actions only serve the common good, not their personal good, So from a purely self-interested viewpoint, it doesn't seem worth the effort.
The pizza party analogy comes to mind. Everyone's asked to chip in $5, but some just show up hoping for a free slice.
That's the common analogy
Yeah.
used, yeah, to illustrate that perceived dilemma. And it creates a really powerful disincentive for anyone to act first.
And this is the surprising twist in this research, isn't it?
It really is.
They argue we are emphatically not at a pizza party in this situation.
Right. That whole mindset, that deeply held belief in the free rider dilemma, that's the real barrier, according to these sources.
Not the science, not the solutions, not even just selfishness.
Not primarily, no. It's the framing of the challenge, how we think about it.
Wow. That's pretty counterintuitive. So it's about perception, not necessarily the hard reality.
Essentially, yes. And what's fascinating is the way they suggest seeing things differently. A really powerful reframing.
Okay, tell us about that. How do they suggest we shift our view?
Well, Overshoot, just by its scale, is a global thing. It's too big for any single entity, even a powerful country, to just fix a reverse on its own.
Right, that makes sense.
So instead of asking that huge, maybe paralyzing question, how can I fix Overshoot? They suggest a much more strategic, more actionable question.
Which is it?
How will I respond given this predictable global reality?
Okay, so it's less about shouldering the burden of saving the planet single-handedly
Is that
and more about navigating a changing landscape, a new reality.
precisely? This reframes Overshoot completely. It stops being your personal burden and becomes a shared, non-negotiable context.
Like gravity or the weather?
Kind of, yeah. It's a context that, they argue, will increasingly shape what works and what fails in societies, in economies, everywhere. So you don't try to stop gravity, you figure out how it affects you and plan accordingly.
And a key insight that falls out of this perspective is that waiting for others to act first, it gives you zero strategic advantage.
None whatsoever. In fact, they argue the opposite. The less others prepare for the predictable consequences climate impacts, resource constraints, the higher the risk actually becomes for you.
Huh. So waiting is actually self-defeating.
In this context, yes, it's a losing strategy.
Now, the material doesn't just leave it there. It also offers some good news and a couple of core insights that emerge from this reframed view.
They do. The research is quite clear. Overshoot will end. Ecological limits are real, and they will eventually be met.
Right.
The only real question is how it ends. Will it be by design, meaning we manage the transition proactively, intentionally, or by disaster, meaning natural consequences impose limits on us in a chaotic, damaging way?
Okay, so that's the choice. Design or disaster. And the first central insight that comes from seeing it this way.
It directly tackles that free rider mindset we talked about.
How?
The insight is this. Responding to Overshoot is fundamentally in your own self-interest.
Ah,
This is where ecological necessity and sort of hard-nosed economic logic actually converge.
okay.
When cities or companies or even individuals recognize that resource security and ecological resilience aren't just nice-to-have green extras,
But they're core.
but they're core components of their own economic stability, their competitiveness, their future success, then the motivation shifts completely.
It's not about sacrifice anymore.
No, it becomes about securing your own future value, your own well-being.
That makes a lot of sense. It definitely moves it from feeling like pure altruism to just being pragmatic. And the second insight, you mentioned it was maybe even more powerful.
Yes. The second insight is that the most effective actions, the ones that really point towards ending Overshoot by design, not disaster, are replicable win-win strategies.
Replicable win-win. What does that mean in practice? Give us some examples.
Okay, so these are responses that do two things at once. First, they boost your own resilience, your resource security, your success. And second, they're designed in a way that they can be scaled up, they can be copied and adopted globally. They're good for the individual actor and good for the planet at the same time.
So things like insulating your home properly, that saves you money and reduces energy demand overall.
Exactly. Or putting solar panels on your roof.
Right. Generates clean energy for you and potentially the grid.
Or larger scale things, like restoring local ecosystems, which can improve water security and biodiversity locally, but the approach can be replicated elsewhere.
Or designing cities to be more lockable, more dense.
Perfect example. Reduces emissions, improves health, makes the city more efficient, benefits the residents and the planet. The research calls these power of possibility responses.
And they contrast these with, what was it, selfish bunker solutions.
Yeah, exactly. Actions that might benefit one person or group temporarily, like hoarding resources, but they can't possibly scale to address the global challenge. They don't fix the underlying systemic issue.
Got it. So the win-win actions are the ones that actually offer a viable pathway to a future within planetary means.
That's the idea.
Okay, this is really compelling, but it brings up a big question, the one the listener is probably shouting at their device right now.
I can guess what it is.
If it's truly in our self-interest and these replicable win-win solutions actually exist, why do we still see so little measurable, concerted action at the scale that's clearly needed?
It's the crucial question, isn't it? And it loops right back to that misperception we discussed earlier.
Right.
Another perspective the material presents is this persistent idea that sustainability is still largely seen or felt as noble self-sacrifice.
Ah, that internal debate. How much am I willing to give up? How much pain am I willing to endure for the greater good, for humanity?
Right, and that framing, that internal dialogue, it generates hesitation, it generates inaction, or often it manifests as what the authors call virtue signaling.
Meaning,
Actions that look good, that signal you care, but they lack the real speed, the scale, the impact required to actually address the growing pressures.
and why does that happen, according to the sources?
Because of that persistent, but they argue false, belief that the effort involved, the cost, outweighs the direct tangible benefits the actor would get themselves from taking those actions.
But the reality, they keep emphasizing, is just purely pragmatic. It's not about nobility.
It really isn't, according to this view. Responding isn't just altruism, it's fundamentally about self-preservation and protecting value.
Because
Because assets, businesses, cities, whole economies that fail to adapt to the predictable future, a future shaped by climate change and resource constraints, they will inevitably lose value. It's almost an accounting certainty.
so delays are costly, waiting is self-defeating.
Exactly. The knowledge is largely there. Many solutions exist. What's missing, they argue, is the widespread desire to prepare. And that desire is missing because of this ingrained but incorrect belief that it's all just a sacrifice.
What about targets, then? We hear constantly about emissions targets, climate goals, net zero by 2050. Aren't those helpful? Don't they drive action?
Well, targets are absolutely essential for effective management. You can't manage what you don't measure, right? They provide clarity, a direction of travel. They allow us to measure progress or lack thereof. They enable accountability. Policies without measurable targets, as one source points out, are basically toothless, pretty meaningless.
Okay, so targets are good, but I sense a but coming.
There's a significant but, a catch they refer to as the target's paradox.
The target's paradox.
Yeah. While targets are essential, setting a target also inherently sets constraints. It codifies obligations.
Yeah.
And crucially, targets can sometimes inadvertently reinforce that very free rider or noble self-sacrifice belief we've been talking about.
Well, that seems completely backward.
It does seem counterintuitive, but think about it. By framing action primarily as a requirement, an obligation to meet some distant, perhaps abstract goal, like net zero by 2050, targets can, paradoxically, generate resistance to the very actions they're trying to promote, because it feeds that feeling of, this is being imposed on me, it's a cost, a sacrifice for some future goal.
Can you give an example?
They use a really interesting analogy with airline safety. Think about the incredible ongoing effort that goes into reducing airplane fatalities, which are already vanishingly small compared to, say, road travel.
Right, flying is incredibly safe.
Hugely safe. Now, is that massive effort primarily driven by some top-down global target for reducing fatalities per million miles flown, set by some international body?
Probably not, no.
No, it's driven by the clear, shared, absolutely undeniable self-interest of everyone involved.
Like who?
Airlines want to stay in business. Crashes are bad for business. Manufacturers want to sell safe planes. Regulators need public trust. Pilots want to land safely. And passengers, well, we all want to arrive alive.
Right, the benefit of safety is immediate and obvious to everyone.
Exactly. That direct, tangible benefit motivates continuous improvement, constant vigilance, massive investment, largely without needing a central target to define the sacrifice required.
And the argument is that for Overshoot, for resource security, that same level of direct, recognized self-interest is somehow missing or not understood.
That's the core of the paradox they highlight. Now, to be clear, the authors aren't arguing against quantification or metrics. Metrics are vital for science, for good decision-making.
Of course.
But their point is, for scientific findings or targets to actually translate into widespread desire and action, they need to be perceived as useful. They need to demonstrate a direct, tangible benefit to the person or the city or the company that's supposed to act.
Otherwise.
Otherwise, they tend to limit adoption or they trigger that perception of sacrifice, obligation, and resistance.
Okay, let's try and pull all these different threads together then. The core message coming through from this material seems to be,
Overshoot is real. It's a predictable future context that's already shaping our world right now.
and the main barrier to actually dealing with it effectively isn't a lack of knowledge or a lack of solutions.
No, it's this fundamental misperception, this widespread belief that acting is primarily a costly sacrifice, rather than being profoundly in one's own self-interest.
And the key takeaway, the good news perhaps, is that recognizing this reality isn't about doom and gloom. It actually reveals huge opportunities.
Exactly. Opportunities for those powerful, replicable, win-win strategies. We talked about strategies that benefit you directly and can also scale globally.
Right.
Ending overshoot by design, not disaster, really requires fostering the desired act.
And that desire comes when?
It emerges when people, when organizations, when communities see action not just as necessary, but as strategically better than inaction for themselves.
Driven by the pragmatic need to prepare.
Exactly. Preparing for a predictable future where resource security and ecological resilience aren't just environmental nice-to-haves, but are core drivers of success, stability, and value creation.
That really does flip the script, doesn't it? It shifts the whole focus away from guilt and global mandates towards self-interest, resilience, and local opportunity.
Indeed. And that leaves us with a pretty powerful final thought for you, the listener, to maybe sit with and mull over.
Okay, what is it? Let's hear it.
Well, given everything we've discussed, that recognizing overshoot actually reveals your own risks and your own opportunities.
Right.
And that the most effective responses are these replicable win-win strategies. How does thinking about resource security not as some abstract global problem, but as a really key factor for your own well-being, your own success, how does that change what self-interest really looks like for you? Whether that's personally, in your job, or maybe in your local community.
That is a great question to ponder. It really forces you to reevaluate your perspective, doesn't it?
It does.
Well, thank you for walking us through that. It's been a fascinating deep dive into these sources.
My pleasure. It's a critical reframing, I think.
And thank you for listening. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.